Well, in 2020, Cardi B's song WAP made Song of the Year according to NPR. This was a song where she was writhing on the floor, talking about her body parts and referring to herself as a whore. And so, what does it say in our culture when something like NPR, that's our national public radio here in America, would refer to a song like that as Song of the Year? What do we believe about human sexuality? And your perspective on human sexuality, the narrative or the story that you buy into, is going to have a lot to say in how you would think of a song like Cardi B's WAP. For example, perhaps you thought, boy, this was really empowering for women. Maybe you thought this is disgusting. Maybe you thought it was sinful. Maybe you thought it was highly inappropriate. Maybe you looked at that and thought it was sad that she would degrade herself in that manner. Well, in this short series, we're going to look at three narratives or three stories about human sexuality. Cultural narrative, and primarily when I say cultural, I'm talking about America, where I live. The cultural narrative, cultural perspective on sexuality. Then we have the evangelical purity culture narrative on sexuality. And then finally, the biblical narrative on human sexuality. And so a narrative is a spoken or written account of connected events or a story. It is the story we tell ourselves about something like sexuality. And so Dr. Juli Slattery, in her book, Rethinking Sexuality, she details these three narratives. Now, I will link this book in the description of this video. And over the next three videos, we're going to cover these three narratives that she talks about: cultural, purity, and biblical. It's an excellent resource. She's done a great job of breaking down these three narratives. So in this video, we're going to talk about culture. So let's look at what the culture would say about sexuality, which is going to impact how it would respond to something like Cardi B's WAP. Well, unless you are living in a cave, we are bombarded by messages on sexuality. So many things are teaching us, speaking to us about human sexuality, and what we believe is going to be impacted by those messages. So for example, in Colossians 2:8, we are instructed, see to it that no one takes you captive by philosophy and empty deceit, according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirits of the world, and not according to Christ. There's a reality that these messages are going to have an impact on us. They could even take us captive. We are being spoken to about sexuality from the culture. So let's look at 5 things that the culture values when it comes to human sexuality. And maybe as we look at these 5 things, we wouldn't come outright and say them, this is what I believe, but it is an underspoken message. It is a narrative about sexuality. So the first one, your sexuality is an important part of identity and personal expression. So when it comes to something like Cardi B's WAP, we're simply going to say, well, she is expressing herself. She's being her true self. She's putting that out there. And in this way, it's something that is to be valued. Well, the second one, maturity in your sexuality, according to our culture, is sexual experimentation and freedom. So things like experimentation, things like novelty and experience, these are things that we value. And so you should pursue those things as you're expressing yourself. A while back, I did a video on monogamy versus the hookup culture. And one of the things that the hookup culture values is novelty. Get new experiences and try new things. Third, you are the boss of your own sexuality. Trust your instincts. So when we ask the question, who has authority on human sexuality, the answer from the culture is that you do. What you feel, what you believe. In fact, you shouldn't let other people impose their beliefs upon you. You must continue to express yourself. You are the authority on human sexuality. You do you is a phrase that we hear frequently. So to respond to Cardi B, she is being true to herself. She is the boss. So in that sense, the culture would say it is valuable. Well, number 4, sexual ethics and morality are limited to issues of consent and not judging people. So the good news is here that even American culture, we have rules, we have boundaries on sexuality. Thank God, things like rape are not appropriate. There are laws against that thing. In fact, even if you look at number 1, 2, and 3, American culture doesn't fully believe in those things because we have put boundaries and laws. So for example, there's certain experimentation that you cannot do. Taking advantage of somebody else. We have laws against those things. We don't even really fully believe 1, 2, and 3 because we have laws violating people's consent. And then also on this issue of judging people, I would say that's not 100% true. I mean, if you choose monogamy, I look at somebody like Tim Tebow who chose monogamy. He was mocked for that. He experienced ridicule for that. He was judged for the choices that he made. Now, of course, if you like Tim Tebow, would you be sure to like this message, subscribe if you want to see more, help this message to spread and the channel to grow. Cultural view of sexuality values individual expression as more important than family or community. Okay, now I think this one is important. because a lot of the messaging we see from the culture is that you should cast off family, you should cast off old rules, old authority, people who would tell you what to do. Those things should be undervalued, and what you believe should be expressed. Now, I hope I don't ruin like a bunch of Disney movies for you, but I think you can, over a time and time again, you see this message in Disney movies. A classic example would be Moana, where she rejects what her cultural traditions and values have been. She rejects the authority of her father. She goes beyond the reef. And another good example would be in the movie Frozen. I'll put up some of the lyrics here. In that movie Frozen, where Queen Elsa begins to sing, let it go, can't hold it back anymore. Not going to sing for you. That just wouldn't be great. Turn away and slam the door. I don't care what they're going to say. Let the storm rage on. The cold never bothered me anyway. It's time to see what I can do. Test the limits and break through. No right, no wrong, no rules for me. I'm free. So one of the messages from the cultural view, one of the messages from Disney is cast off old authority. Now, don't hear me wrong. I'm not trying to say that Moana and Frozen were this perspective on sexuality, but they give us an example of throwing off authority, throwing off community values, throwing off parental authority, and expressing yourself and being true to yourself. So what are some problems with this view? What are some problems with the cultural perspective? Well, one thing we need to realize is that this really isn't new. In 1 Thessalonians 4 and verse 5, we're admonished that we're not to live our sexuality in the passion of lust like the Gentiles who do not know God. If you view sexuality, if you view something like Cardi B as, my goodness, in 2022 or in 2020 when that song came out, this is as bad as it's ever been, just read the book of Corinthians. This is nothing new. There's nothing new under the sun. Not consistent with the biblical worldview of Creator and God's authority in every area of life. It is a rejection, ultimately, of the lordship of Christ, that he shouldn't have authority, he shouldn't speak into your life. Second, it's not consistent with the view that the human heart is deceitful. If you believe that you need to follow your heart, if you believe that you are the authority, then you believe your heart is leading and guiding you in a good way. But the scriptures would say that is not true. In fact, in Jeremiah, it says the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. Who can understand it? So ultimately, following your heart, it is not going to be a good guide. Letting your feelings be the authority is asking for trouble. Number 3, it's going to result in harm for culture and individuals. We see examples throughout our culture, pornography, gender confusion, broken families. The Me Too movement exposed a lot of the behind-the-scenes violation of following your heart, of expressing yourself, of people using their power to abuse others. The Me Too movement exposed a lot of these things. How many ills take place in our society as a result of people following their feelings, rejecting any sort of authority, any sort of biblical norms, and following their heart? I think we could make a long, long list on that. And so the culture has a certain narrative on sexuality. It is one of extreme. And the church is going to have kind of a divided position on this, both the purity and the biblical narrative. Those are the next 2 things that we're going to cover in this series. So let me know your thoughts on the cultural narrative. Does Dr. Juli Slattery in her book get it right when she talks about how the culture describes sexuality? I will link to her book. You can check that out, and be sure to subscribe if you want to see the next video in this series where we break down the evangelical purity culture view on sexuality.